Who would have thought a high society gala could change a boy's life forever? When Millionaire CEO Matthew Settle told his 9-year-old son Adam to choose a new mother from the city's most elegant and powerful women, he expected a name that would please the press and his business partners. But when Adam walked across the room and took the hand of Susan Misner, a modest kindergarten teacher with paint on her sleeve and a smile meant only for him, the entire ballroom fell silent. What happened next would shake Matthew's world, test loyalties, and prove that sometimes the right choice comes from the smallest voice in the room. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The Grand Astoria Hotel glowed like a palace that winter night. Outside, snowflakes drifted under the golden light of the street lamps, melting the moment they touched the heated marble steps. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers, their light spilling over silk gowns, tailored tuxedos, and champagne glasses that caught every flicker of the season. It was the annual Winter Benefactors Gala, a place where the city's elite gathered to be seen, to be photographed, and to quietly decide the fate of charities over glasses of vintage wine. For Matthew Settle, it was more than another social obligation. Tonight was a test. Tall and impeccably dressed in a midnight suit, Matthew stood near the entrance, a controlled smile on his lips as he exchanged greetings with other guests. Beside him, his 9-year-old son Adam shifted his weight from foot to foot, his small hands tucked into the pockets of a miniature tuxedo. His brown eyes scanned the crowd with the kind of detached caution that looked far too old for his age. Matthew leaned slightly toward him. "Remember what I told you?" His voice was low, meant only for Adam. "Tonight you get to choose. Anyone here could be the right fit for us." Adam didn't look at him. His gaze lingered on the polished floor. He gave the faintest shrug. The first hour of the gala was a blur of introductions. Matthew guided Adam through clusters of women who were flawless on paper. Daughters of politicians, CEOs of charities, women whose names graced society columns with regularity. They smiled warmly at the boy, spoke to him in careful, measured tones, and just as quickly lost interest when his answers were short and his eyes drifted away. With each encounter, Adam's shoulders seemed to curl in a little more. Matthew noticed but said nothing. He'd been certain this plan would make sense. Let Adam feel involved. Let him choose a woman who could bring warmth into their home while understanding the demands of Matthew's world. Yet the distance in his son's posture felt like a warning he couldn't quite interpret. It was during the children's charity segment, set up in a quiet corner of the ballroom, that Matthew briefly lost sight of him. Looking around, he caught a glimpse of his son at a long table covered with paints and brushes. Adam's tuxedo jacket was gone, his white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, his small hands steady as he painted the crooked outline of a tree. Beside him sat a woman Matthew didn't recognize. She wasn't in sequins or silk. She wore a simple navy dress that brushed just below the knee, with a cardigan pushed up at the elbows. Her light brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, and there was a faint smudge of green paint on her cuff. She leaned closer to Adam, smiling at something he had said, her voice quiet but warm. Matthew crossed the room, the noise of the gala fading into the background. "Adam," he called gently. The boy looked up, and for the first time that evening, his smile reached his eyes. "Dad, this is Miss Misner," Adam said, pointing to the woman beside him. "She's a teacher. She helped me fix my tree because I messed it up." The woman straightened and offered her hand, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "Susan Misner," she said. "I work with the children's art program here." We set up a little station to keep them entertained while the adults do their thing. Matthew took her hand briefly. I appreciate you keeping him company. Adam didn't let go of her hand. His fingers tightened around hers with the certainty of someone making a decision. Dad, he said clearly, I want her to be my mom. Matthew froze. For a moment, the sound of the gala, the clinking glasses, the polite laughter, the steady hum of the string quartet felt very far away. This wasn't part of the plan. For a heartbeat, Matthew wondered if he'd misheard. The sounds of the ballroom, the clinking of glasses, the swell of strings, the rise and fall of polite laughter, seemed to dim beneath Adam's quiet but certain voice. I want her to be my mom. Matthew's gaze stayed on his son. Adam was still holding Susan's hand. His small fingers curled around hers like he had no intention of letting go. His brown eyes, so often guarded, were steady and unblinking now. There was no trace of a joke in his expression. No hint that this was the passing fancy of a child dazzled by attention. He meant it. Matthew crouched slightly, his hand resting lightly on Adam's shoulder. Adam, he said quietly, we've talked about this. There are a lot of people here you haven't met yet. I met her, Adam replied, just as softly. I like her. The words landed with more weight than they should have. Matthew turned his attention to Susan. She wasn't flustered. If anything, there was a quiet steadiness in her posture, though her eyes held a hint of surprise. She didn't pull her hand away, but she did glance at Adam with a gentle smile before speaking. I think he's just being sweet, she said, her tone calm, even warm. I wouldn't take it too seriously, but Matthew knew his son. Adam didn't hand out his trust easily. He was polite with strangers, careful even with people they saw regularly. And yet here he was, making a declaration that had already begun to ripple through the air around them. From the corner of his eye, Matthew noticed one of the women he'd introduced Adam to earlier. She was watching now, curiosity sharpening into something cooler, the kind of quiet judgment Matthew had seen 1,000 times in boardrooms and ballrooms alike. Her gaze flicked over Susan's simple dress, the faint smudge of paint on her cuff, and then moved on, her lips pressing together in a restrained smile. Susan seemed to sense it, though she didn't react. Instead, she eased her hand from Adam's, giving his fingers a reassuring squeeze before letting go. I should probably let you both get back to your evening, she said. Her voice held no resentment, only a polite withdrawal, as if she knew she was stepping back from something she'd never been meant to enter. She turned toward the table of paints, where a little girl was holding up a dripping brush, clearly in need of rescue. Adam's brows drew together. She was helping me, he said to Matthew, his voice quiet but insistent. Matthew hesitated, then placed a hand on his son's back. We can come back, he murmured, though he doubted they would. The moment had passed. Yet as the evening went on, Adam's disinterest in meeting anyone else became impossible to ignore. Each introduction, each carefully curated conversation with a woman who could move through high society without effort, ended the same way. Polite nods from Adam, eyes drifting toward the far corner where Susan sat with the children. By the time the auction began, Matthew had abandoned the idea of forcing more introductions. He told himself there would be other events, other opportunities. And still, as he made his rounds, his gaze kept finding that quiet corner. Later, when the final toast was given and the guests began to drift toward the coat room, Matthew found Adam waiting near the entrance to the children's station. In his hands was the paper tree they'd painted together. Slightly crooked, one branch thicker than the others, the green paint layered heavily where Adam had fixed his mistake. "She was nice?" Adam said in the car, his voice almost lost beneath the sound of snow brushing against the windows. Matthew glanced at him. "She was," he admitted. "But she's different from the people we talked about." Adam didn't look up from the little tree. "I don't like the other people." There were 100 arguments Matthew could have made. About expectations. About fitting into a life that came with its own set of rules. About the pressure of public eyes. But all of them seemed smaller than the memory of Adam's smile, the first real smile of the evening, given freely to a woman who had no reason to impress either of them. And as the car moved quietly through the snow-dusted streets, Matthew found himself wondering if his son had seen something he had missed entirely. 3 days passed. For Matthew, they were filled with meetings, contract reviews, and a dozen pressing matters that should have left no space for distractions. Yet, in quiet moments, in the back seat of his car between appointments, or in the rare stillness before the first morning call, he would find his thoughts drifting back to that corner of the gala, back to the boy at the paint table, back to the woman in the navy dress with the paint-smudged sleeve, back to Adam's voice, quiet but certain. "I want her to be my mom." Matthew had planned to push the memory aside. It had been a one-off encounter, a moment of warmth on a night that had otherwise been carefully orchestrated. But Adam's focus on her, and his refusal to entertain the idea of anyone else, lingered like a seed he hadn't meant to plant. On the 4th day, a delivery of documents from one of his charity initiatives crossed his desk. It was the quarterly report for the children's art program, the very one that had hosted the painting station at the gala. Flipping through the pages, Matthew's eyes caught on a name in the staff list: Susan Misner, lead art facilitator. For a moment, he stared at it, his thumb resting against the edge of the page. Then, without entirely deciding to, he picked up the phone. "This is Matthew Settle," he told the program coordinator when they answered. "I wanted to thank your team for their contribution at the gala. In particular, one of your staff, Susan Misner." The coordinator's tone warmed. "Oh, Susan's wonderful. The children adore her. She works mornings at Brookside Academy. That's a private kindergarten in the East End, and runs our weekend art sessions." Brookside Academy. The name stirred something in Matthew's memory. A small, bright building he'd driven past more than once on his way to the office. By midday, his schedule had been quietly rearranged. The board meeting was moved to the afternoon. The lunch with investors postponed. At 11:30, Matthew's car pulled up outside the low brick facade of Brookside Academy, its windows decorated with hand-painted snowflakes and construction paper stars. He wasn't sure what he'd say if he saw her. In truth, he wasn't even certain why he'd come. Inside, the front hall smelled faintly of crayons and cinnamon. Children's coats hung in neat rows along one wall. A receptionist looked up from her desk, startled to see a man in a tailored suit standing in the doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I was hoping to speak with Susan Misner," Matthew said. The woman's brow furrowed. "She's just finishing story time with her class. If you don't mind waiting." Before he could answer, a door down the hall opened and the sound of children's voices spilled out, a wave of laughter and chatter. Susan stepped into view, holding a stack of picture books against her hip. Her hair was loose today, curling slightly at the ends, and there was a streak of glitter across one sleeve of her sweater. She spotted him almost immediately. Her steps slowed. "Mr. Settle," she said when she reached him, her tone polite but wary. "This is unexpected." Matthew inclined his head. I wanted to thank you for the other night. Adam enjoyed himself more than he has in a long time. Her expression softened just enough to let the memory of that evening into her voice. He's a good kid. Thoughtful. There was a pause, long enough for the receptionist to glance between them, then discreetly turn her attention back to her computer. I was wondering, Matthew continued, if you'd have time for a coffee sometime this week. I'd like to talk about Adam and perhaps about your work with the art program. Her eyes narrowed slightly. This wouldn't be part of some larger selection process you've got going, would it? The corner of his mouth twitched. No, nothing like that. Susan studied him for a moment longer, as though weighing whether to believe him. Finally, she gave a small nod. I'm free after school on Friday, she said. There's a cafe 2 blocks from here. It's quiet. No ballrooms, no chandeliers. That sounds perfect, Matthew said, and for the first time in a very long while, he realized he actually meant it. Friday afternoon was gray and cold, the kind of winter day where the light never seemed to fully arrive. By the time Matthew parked near the small cafe Susan had mentioned, the sidewalks were damp with melting snow, and the air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the block. Inside, the cafe was warm and unpretentious. A bell above the door chimed as he stepped in, shaking the cold from his coat. The place was small, maybe a dozen tables, with shelves of mismatched mugs and a chalkboard menu written in looping handwriting. At the far corner, Susan sat by the window, a cup cradled between her hands. She noticed him immediately and offered a small nod as he approached. You're early, she said. I didn't want to risk being late, Matthew replied, pulling out the chair across from her. Her smile was faint, almost cautious. This isn't exactly your usual setting, is it? No, he admitted. But I think that's part of the appeal. The waitress came by with a pot of coffee, and Matthew ordered his black. Susan's cup smelled faintly of chamomile and honey. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of steaming milk and low conversation filling the air. So, Susan began, what did you want to talk about? You said Adam. Matthew's fingers rested on the side of his cup. He's a good kid. Quiet, sometimes too quiet. Since his mother passed, he's been careful about who he lets in. Her gaze softened. I noticed, but he's also curious. Once you get him talking about something he cares about, it's like the rest of the room disappears. Matthew allowed himself a small smile. That's exactly what happened the other night. I've never seen him open up so quickly to someone new. Susan sipped her tea. I didn't do anything special. I just listened. Most adults talk at kids. I talk with them. That's special, Matthew said quietly. For a moment, she looked at him as if trying to decide whether the compliment was sincere. Then she set her cup down. Can I ask you something? Of course. She tilted her head slightly. That night at the gala, was it true that you were letting him choose a mother? Matthew's jaw tightened. It was an idea I'd been persuaded into. People in my circle think it would be better for him to have a maternal figure who's comfortable in high society. And you agreed? At the time, yes, he admitted. It made sense on paper. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes told him exactly what she thought of that. Children aren't paper, she said. I know, he replied more quietly now. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a bus passed, spraying slush across the curb. The faint clink of cutlery on porcelain seemed louder in the pause between them. I don't belong in your world, Susan said finally. If this is some experiment or charity or whatever it is people like you do when they're bored, it's not. Matthew cut in, his voice steady but firm. I'm here because my son liked you, because I think he saw something in you I've been too blind to look for. Her eyes held his for a long moment before she looked down at her tea. Well, she murmured, that's a start. They stayed another hour talking about Adam, about the art program, about the way Susan's students lit up when they discovered they could create something from nothing. She told him about growing up in a small town, about working 2 jobs to put her younger sister through school. When they finally stood to leave, the sky outside had shifted to a deep winter blue. I'll walk you to your car, Matthew offered. You don't have to, she said, but she didn't object when he held the door for her. On the sidewalk, their breath clouded in the cold air. Thank you for the tea, Matthew said. Thank you for listening, Susan replied. Then she glanced at him, the faintest smile playing at her lips. See you around, Mr. Settle. As she walked away, the sound of her boots fading into the quiet street, Matthew realized he wanted that around to come sooner rather than later. Over the next 2 weeks, Matthew found reasons to be near Brookside Academy more often than his schedule should have allowed. A meeting conveniently rescheduled would free up a late morning. A site visit for one of his projects happened to be only a few streets away. Sometimes he would catch sight of Susan through the low windows of her classroom, kneeling beside a child at a table, her hair falling loose as she leaned over to check their work. Other times, he would stop by the weekend art sessions, where Adam had begun to appear regularly. The boy's enthusiasm was impossible to ignore. At home, Matthew noticed a change. Adam spoke more at dinner, smiled more easily, and even asked his father questions about his day. It was subtle, but it was there. And in the background of each improvement was Susan. One Saturday, Adam invited Matthew to join them at the art room. The walls were lined with bright paintings, some still drying on their easels. Matthew arrived to find his son painting the outline of a tree, this time taller, straighter, with careful branches, while Susan stood nearby, offering quiet encouragement. Looks like you've improved, Matthew said to Adam, stepping closer. Adam grinned. Susan showed me how to make the leaves look real. Matthew's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room seemed quieter. She smiled. Not the polite kind she'd given him at the gala, but one warmer, more open. It was in moments like this that Matthew began to imagine what it might be like if she were in their lives more permanently. But reality had a way of catching up. That reality arrived one evening in the form of an unexpected phone call from Lydia, his longtime assistant. There's been some chatter, she began. Photos, mostly. Someone saw you leaving that cafe with her. And there are shots of you at the academy last week. Matthew's voice cooled. And now the society blogs are wondering who she is. The more unkind ones are speculating she's a charity case. Lydia hesitated. You know how quickly these things spiral. By Monday it had. At a luncheon with business partners, a fellow CEO made a half-joking remark about Matthew's mystery woman. At the club, an acquaintance offered a knowing smirk and said he admired Matthew's taste for novelty. He felt the judgment in every glance, every carefully phrased question. And yet, none of it compared to what happened when he saw Susan later that week. She was standing outside the academy when he arrived to pick Adam up. Her expression was tight, her posture a little too straight. I saw the articles, she said as soon as Adam went inside to grab his things. Matthew exhaled. I was going to warn you. Warn me. Her eyes flashed. You think I've never been talked about before? This is different, Matthew. They're not just talking about me. They're questioning why I'm anywhere near your son. He stepped closer. Then tell me how to fix it. You can't fix it, she said. Not with your world watching. Not with the rules they play by. Adam came running out then, holding a folded paper in his hands. Look, Dad. I drew us in the park. Susan's gaze softened as she looked at the drawing. But when her eyes lifted back to Matthew, the distance was still there. They said their goodbyes, and as Matthew drove away, Adam chattering beside him, he felt the weight of a truth he'd been trying to ignore. If he wanted Susan in their lives, it wouldn't just be about winning her trust. It would be about standing against an entire world that believed she didn't belong. The week after their tense conversation was quieter than Matthew liked. Adam still went to his art sessions, still came home with paint on his sleeves and a grin on his face. But Susan's presence had changed. She kept their exchanges polite, her smile professional. The warmth he had begun to see, the openness that had made Adam choose her without hesitation, seemed to have retreated behind a closed door. By Thursday, the whispers had reached a new level. The tabloids had moved from speculation to stories, some implying Susan had set her sights on the settled fortune, others hinting she was an unsuitable influence for a child in Adam's position. Matthew was no stranger to headlines, but reading her name there, seeing her life reduced to cruel guesses, lit a different kind of fire in him. The final push came at the annual Midtown Investors Banquet, another high-profile event where his presence was expected. Matthew had intended to keep the evening short, to make an appearance and leave. But midway through, one of the more influential donors cornered him near the bar. I hear you've been keeping interesting company, the man said, his smile thin as glass. A kindergarten teacher, was it? Unusual choice for a man in your position. Matthew's jaw tightened. Adam likes her. Children like candy too, the man replied with a chuckle. Doesn't mean it's good for them. Matthew didn't answer, but in that moment, something inside him hardened. The next day, he was at Brookside before the final bell. He waited near the gate until Susan appeared with her class, her scarf wrapped high against the cold. When she saw him, her steps faltered. Matthew, she said cautiously, is everything. He didn't let her finish. Come with me tonight, he said. There's an event. I want you there. Her eyes narrowed. Why? Because I'm tired of letting other people write our story. She hesitated, glancing toward the children still spilling out of the building. You think showing me off will fix this? No, he said. I think standing beside you will tell them it's not theirs to fix. Hours later, they walked into the Grand Meridian Hotel together. Conversation dipped as they entered. Matthew in his black suit, Susan in a simple deep green dress that skimmed her knees. Her hair was loose, catching the light, and though he could feel the weight of every stare in the room, Matthew kept his hand lightly at her back, guiding her forward. Introductions were brief, but deliberate. When someone made a pointed remark about her work, Matthew answered plainly, she teaches children, and she's extraordinary at it. By the end of the evening, the whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed. The speculation was no longer about whether she belonged, but about the man who had just made it clear he didn't care what anyone thought. That night, as he walked her to her car, Susan looked up at him. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said. I did. She was quiet for a moment, then smiled small but real. Well, thank you. For the first time in weeks, Matthew felt the door between them begin to open again. Winter deepened, and with it, the city slowed beneath a blanket of snow. Matthew had expected that one public appearance with Susan would quiet the whispers. It hadn't. The scrutiny simply shifted, less cruel but constant. Yet through it all, she kept showing up. For Adam's art sessions, for walks through the park, for quiet afternoons in the small cafe where they first talked. Adam seemed lighter now, quick to laugh, eager to tell both of them about his day. And Matthew found himself lingering over the small things. The way Susan brushed snow from Adam's hair, the sound of her laugh when he told her about his early business mistakes, the rare moments she let her guard down completely. One Sunday afternoon, they were in the park. Adam was building a lopsided snow fort while Matthew and Susan stood nearby, coffee cups in hand. The air was sharp, the sky pale and low. "He's happy," Susan said, watching the boy work. "He is," Matthew agreed. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Because of both of us." He turned to her then, his expression serious. "Susan, I don't care about the rules of my world. I care about him, and I care about you. I want us to be something real, not just in quiet corners where no one's watching." Her breath misted in the cold as she searched his face. "You know what that means, don't you? They'll never stop looking for cracks. Then we don't give them any." For a long moment, the only sound was Adam's laughter in the snow. Then she stepped closer. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's try." Adam noticed them then and ran over, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Can we go get hot chocolate? The kind with the big marshmallows?" Matthew smiled. "All of us." Adam nodded. "All of us." It was such a simple thing, but in the way Susan's hand found Matthew's, he knew it was the start of everything they'd been moving toward. The seasons turned. Spring brought color back to the city, and with it, a rhythm that felt less like balancing between two worlds and more like building their own. Susan moved into the townhouse that summer, bringing with her boxes of books, shelves of art supplies, and a warmth that made every room feel lived in. Adam's laughter filled the halls more often now, and on weekends, the three of them would walk to the park or spend hours in the kitchen. Susan showing Adam how to bake muffins while Matthew pretended not to make a mess with the flour. There were still glances sometimes, still questions at certain events. But the edge of judgment had dulled, replaced by the quiet understanding that the three of them together, wasn't a phase. One December evening, nearly a year after the gala, they returned to the Grand Astoria for the Winter Benefactors Gala. It was in the same glittering ballroom, under the same chandeliers. But this time, Matthew entered with Susan on his arm and Adam walking proudly between them. When people looked, they saw no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a family. Later, as snow fell outside the tall windows, Adam slipped a folded piece of paper into Susan's hand. It was a drawing. The three of them in the park, holding mugs of hot chocolate, the word home written in bold letters above their heads. She smiled, her eyes bright, and Matthew knew that no matter what the world thought, they had already chosen the only thing that mattered: each other.